Simple Insights, your best YouTube channel.
This is Japan, perhaps one of the most amazing countries on the planet. Just 150 years ago, Japan was a medieval state that isolated itself from the rest of the world. But soon it would be forced to become a mighty empire, then lose the largest war in history and rise from the ashes, conquering the world not with weapons, but with its technology. Yet Japan would be unable to hold on to this power because after a deafening boom it would slide into a unique economic crisis that has lasted for the last 30 years. How did this happen? And why does the most progressive and one of the richest countries in the world suffer from what all other states are striving for? Before you is the story of the astonishing tragedy of the land of the rising sun. Look at what the world looked like in the middle of the 19th century. The largest continental empire is the Russian one, and the transcontinental is the British. The main trade routes run through the Atlantic and Indian Oceans between Europe, India, and the United States. And almost no one sails to Japan. It is far, inconvenient, and, most importantly, pointless. This is because the Japanese authorities have pursued a policy of self-isolation for decades. Japan's elites do not want to depend on trade with the West and fear foreign cultural influence that could undermine order inside the country. While in the United States and Europe the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, Tokyo remains a big village where people pay taxes in rice. In short, Western technology is roughly 50 years ahead of Japan, but there are fewer and fewer blank spots left on the map, and therefore competition for markets is growing. The United States is actively developing Pacific routes, trading with China. But the path to China is long, and it would be useful to have an intermediate stop. Japan could become exactly that, but the land of the rising sun is closed and hostile. Its emperor has even ordered the coastal guard to kill on the spot any foreigners who land without permission. But everything changed on July 14, 1853. On that day, residents of the Japanese island of Honshu saw 4 black ships on the horizon. A couple of hours later, American warships moored offshore. An expedition from the United States led by Commodore Matthew Perry presented an ultimatum to the Japanese elites. Either Japan opens its ports for trade, or the United States will use force. Knowing how, not long before China refused to trade on fair terms and lost the First Opium War, effectively becoming a British colony, the Japanese elites decided to accept the proposal. Thus, 6 months later, the United States and Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, under which U.S. ships could now freely enter the Japanese ports of Shimoda and Hakodate and trade without any duties. So the United States, instead of an enemy, gained an excellent sales market. You might ask, what is the big deal? Let them trade. This is even good. But after the treaty, the Japanese market was flooded with cheap industrial goods with which Japanese artisans could not compete because of their low price. Many Japanese simply went bankrupt. At that pace, the land of the rising sun risked becoming one of many Western colonies that sell cheap raw materials and buy expensive foreign goods. But Japan, unlike India and China, turned out to be a special country that became one of the most developed powers in merely about 50 years. When the Americans arrived in Japan on steamships, Japan was still a medieval state ruled by the shogun, the supreme samurai. Under him were local lords, the daimyo, who governed separate territories, and under them were lower-rank samurai. At the bottom of this estate pyramid were ordinary people, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. In this structure, the Emperor of Japan played only a formal role because military force and real power were in the hands of the shogun. But as in any feudal system, the shogun's resources largely went to holding power rather than economic growth. Therefore, when unfavorable international trade with the United States began, the authority of the shogun who had dishonored the country weakened. Some feudal lords who opposed the shogun wanted to return power to the emperor. Others close to the shogun did not want to lose their position. Therefore, in 1868, a civil war began in Japan. But here the Japanese showed a unique trait. Wounded national pride and dislike of Western traders did not lead to a years-long bloodbath, but rather to the fact that after a year and a half, power was voluntarily transferred to Emperor Meiji, and former opponents of the emperor joined the new government. And so, just 15 years after Japan's forced opening, power in the country changed completely. It was seized by new elites interested in restructuring the country's politics and economy to restore sovereignty. The Japanese understood that either they would stand alongside Europeans and Americans and dictate their own terms, or they would face the fate of neighboring China, which lost 2 opium wars and became a colony of Western powers. In 1871, a delegation headed by envoy Iwakura Tomomi sailed from Japan toward San Francisco. In the group photograph of the Iwakura mission, you can see how quickly Japanese leaders embraced change. Only one of its 5 leaders, Iwakura himself, remained in traditional Japanese clothing, while the others already wore Western suits and European haircuts. Over the next 3 years, the Iwakura mission traveled across the United States and Europe, visiting 120 cities and towns where the Japanese studied the workings of the Western world. In Great Britain, they were impressed by Liverpool's shipyards, Manchester's textile mills, and Newcastle's steel works. There, Iwakura and his colleagues saw the future Japan needed to reach. And when they arrived in Germany, the Japanese understood exactly how to achieve that future. In 1872, the Japanese invited European engineers and, with their help, opened the first railway which connected Tokyo with Yokohama. Just imagine that only a couple of decades earlier, many Japanese were doomed to work their entire lives in a rice field for their feudal lord, and now they could simply take a train and in a few hours get to another city and find work there. These working hands were desperately needed because Japan's main export goods, silk and cotton, were produced in huge quantities, not thanks to advanced factories, which did not yet exist, but due to cheap labor. The new policy allowed Japan to make a huge leap, rapidly turning from a feudal country into an industrial state. However, for real growth, it needed resources, coal and iron ore, which are extremely scarce on the Japanese islands. Therefore, as soon as Japan modernized the army, it first fought with China and seized Taiwan, and then defeated Russia in the War of 1905, and thanks to this, 5 years later, annexed Korea, making it its colony. In general, by the beginning of the 20th century, Japan turned from a village into a true empire and became the dominant force in Asia. And World War I, in which Japan successfully participated on the side of the Entente, further strengthened the Japanese government in the conviction that it was on the right path. By the late 1930s, Japan reached the peak of militarist and nationalist sentiment and nurtured an idea of superiority over other countries in its region. Therefore, in World War II, Japan took the side of Germany in the hope that together they could contain the Soviet Union and the United States and take their place as global leaders. But Japan suffered a crushing defeat. It made a whole series of strategic mistakes, fell under resource embargoes, and in the end, faced a new weapon that forced it to capitulate once and for all. Defeat in World War II became a blow that seemed impossible to survive. Japan's economy should have been thrown back by decades, and so it would have been if the Cold War had not begun. Imagine Japan after World War II. The former empire has spectacularly lost the largest conflict in human history. 2 atomic bombs are dropped on it, destroying the country's largest cities. 4% of the population die in the war, and another around 10% are left homeless. The empire no longer exists. Its territories are taken by the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. But the worst thing for many Japanese was that 80 years after the start of progressive reforms, the country again found itself under Western power, namely under U.S. occupation. The essence of the occupation was that an American administration headed by General Douglas MacArthur moved into Japan and, through the Japanese government, began to carry out reforms to demilitarize and liberalize the country. A new constitution was adopted in Japan, censorship was abolished, clan monopolies were dismantled, and the emperor was again removed from governing the country and became a symbol of the nation. In general, Japan was forcibly rebuilt along the lines of Western democracies. However, the country's economy was in very poor shape. The government printed money on a massive scale, hoping thereby to support production and reduce unemployment. But money was being printed while production did not grow, and so the country was seized by hyperinflation. However, the United States did not overly care about restoring the economy of a former enemy. The task was not to let Japan again become a serious threat in the Pacific, and it is unknown when and how Japan would have gotten out of this pit if the active phase of the Cold War had not begun. Based on your feedback, I'll decide whether to continue making videos like this. Take care of yourself and your capital.